Good to see you. Thanks for coming. This is another episode of Wireframe brought to you by Design Systems House. I'm your host, Donnie D'Amato, and today we're going to be talking about the source of truth. Source of truth. That's right. Oh my God, I couldn't even think of it for a second. Goodness gracious, what's wrong with me? I mean, it's been a while. And hopefully you hear me better. We did the interview with Andy Hay last week. And it sounded like I was out in the distance, and that's because I have new equipment here since the last time I had new equipment, which has been a little bit of a journey. So I bumped up the gain on the microphone. You should be able to hear me now, but I'm going to test this out after this is all done and get to the bottom of it. But we will be talking about the source of truth, but I do want to give you a couple of updates. I don't know if I mentioned this last week, but I had a couple of other interviews that were scheduled that have been since postponed in certain different ways. So I was actually supposed to be interviewing Matthew Strom tonight. However, he had to push it back because of the holidays. And we were going to be talking about all sorts of different things. We've had debates here in New York on different topics all the time, and he's really looking forward to being on here. And I'm looking forward to having him on the show as well. So absolutely keep your eyes peeled for that show. And then additionally, I have a founder of the company called Fabra, who's going to be on the show, I think, in the new year as well, who was supposed to be this week, or last week. But we will get there, most certainly. In terms of upgrades as well, we're going to be talking to Stella. Stella is the name of the AI that I've been speaking to on the show for the last, I don't know, few months, right? So I've had this doll thing that's been over here, and I have a name tag for Stella now. You can see the Stella over here. I also planned to have that name tag for the folks that are on the show as well. So unfortunately, I didn't have it in time for Andy last week, but I will have it in time, of course, now that it's here for the rest of the folks that will be on my show. And if you want to be on the show, absolutely come over to wireframe.ds.house and submit some information into the form on the bottom of the page to be on the show. And we'll get you scheduled and all that kind of good stuff in the new year. But to start, speaking of Stella, let's ask Stella, and see if this works, because I actually haven't tested this, but we're going to give it a shot, about what the source of truth... Well, let's just ask Stella right here. Here we go. Hey, in the world of design systems, what does the source of truth mean?
In the context of design systems, the source of truth refers to the authoritative source of information and design specifications that govern the design system. It is the definitive reference and ultimate authority on the system's components, standards, and conventions.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, when we're talking about a source of truth, is there supposed to be one source of truth, or is there, is it good to have multiple sources of truth?
In design systems, it's generally recommended to have only one source of truth, as it helps maintain consistency and clarity in the design system. When there is only one source of truth, it is easier to manage and maintain the system, as all team members know exactly where to look for the most accurate and up-to-date information.
Okay, yep, that makes sense to me. But if a team was going to maintain multiple sources of truth, then how does that work? What kind of things would they be thinking about?
If a team were to maintain multiple sources of truth in a design system, they would need to consider several things. Communication and consistency. It's important that all team members are communicating and staying consistent with the information in the various sources of truth. And version control. It's important to have a way to track and manage changes to each source of truth and ensure that everyone is working from the most up-to-date versions. Conflict management. With multiple sources of truth, it's quite possible that conflicts will arise.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense, right? Because if you have some data on one hand, like let's say in GitHub, and then some data somewhere else in like Figma, then where is that source of truth being maintained, right? It's a good question, right? How would you handle that?
It's important to choose one system to be the primary source of truth. This will be the main tool or database where all information is stored and updated. Then ensure that all other tools sync with this primary source of truth. Additionally, create a schedule for syncing data across tools and make sure all team members are aware of the process so conflicts and errors can be avoided.
All right. So basically, Stella there, the AI, is kind of agreeing with what my typical stance ends up being, which is if you're going to have a source of truth, have a source of the truth. Okay. And the reason that I'm bringing this up is that I saw this new project that on LinkedIn that was kind of giving this feature, and I'll bring it up on the computer here, uh, the ability to sync between GitHub and Figma. Here it is on the computer. Let's bring that up. Here it is. It's called Gitfig. Gitfig. Let's make this larger here. Yeah, so it's called Gitfig, and the thing that it's basically saying right here in the top, it says bi-directional sync for design systems and prototypes. Bring your version control branches and pull requests to your design workflow. The important thing here is this right here on the on this image, so to speak. Here, you have Figma design and make and syncs with GitHub repos and branches, and importantly, then that word up top said bi-directional sync. Okay, so that's the thing that I'm kind of talking about here is that you have this idea of saying, okay, if I make a change in Figma, then it goes all the way to GitHub. But if I make a change in GitHub, it goes also back to Figma. So at the surface, this sounds like a good idea because it keeps it all in sync, right? It's like whatever change that happens over here, then Figma will know about it. Any change that happens in GitHub, then Figma will. Well, is that what I just said? Whatever. It's just back and forth, right? So it sounds like a good idea when you have, things that are changing between those two places. But when we're talking about a source of truth, which one is the source of truth, right? If I make a change in Figma and it's meant to update GitHub, then that means that Figma is the source of truth until you make the change in GitHub and then it's meant to change Figma, right? And you don't know where I'm supposed to be making the change, right? That's the thing that I'm really trying to convey here is that if we're going to have a source of truth, it needs to be a single source that all of these places need to go to, right? Needs to be informed by several different things, right? Be informed by one thing to several different places. Let me be clear about that, right? So, in my opinion, because code is the thing that our users see, right, and interact with and experience, right? That's the application that our users are using, then that should, in my eyes, be the source of truth because it is the thing that users are going to be using, right? A thing like Figma can only ever be a representation of what a user is using, right? It is never going to be put in front of users as the actual application that they are going to be using, right? That is not its purpose, not its intention. Its intention is always to be a representation of the thing that's going to be in front of users, right? So that's the thing that I want to kind of like convey here is that, I've said this I think with Andy last week as well, that we see lots of people in our industry in design that are limited by what Figma is doing, right? Even if we could do whatever it is in code, right? Container query is a great example. Figma can't do that, or at least can't do it to the same way that we could do it in code. So there's lots of like workarounds or even avoidance to do it that way, even if we could do it in code, right? And that's why I always recommend that code ends up being the source of truth because that's the thing that ends up coming in front of users. Now, if that's the source of truth, that means that if we need representations of that source of truth, they should be based off of the source of truth, not something that's basically trying to inform the source of truth. I never thought that the Figma to code thing was ever really a valid direction for this stuff. And that's why I raise the importance of folks in the design engineering space, right? Because I've always believed in that hot potato kind of mentality. That was the Brad Frost and Dan Moll presentation that's happened years ago. You could look it up. But effectively, the idea is that you would have a designer like a Dan Moll and a front-end engineer or design engineer like Brad Frost that would work together to create the source of truth, the final output, right? So Dan would work on the side and kind of remix some stuff and share it with the engineer. And the engineer is the person who's implementing, right? That's the person that's actually putting it up to the users, right? That's the thing that's actually working. So when the designer shares that with the engineer has to interpret what that is and potentially even put in their own expertise in there as well. But that's always just an interpretation, right? But that code is the source of truth. So if we wanted to make assets that were going to help us convey what we want to do as designers and engineers and what have you, we should be able to take the source of truth that we have, right, components and tokens and things like that, and inform them across other platforms that accept those sources of truth. So as an example, there is a plugin, I guess they'll call it, at html.2.design. And there's actually a whole bunch of stuff at 2.design. This redirects to a Figma plugin, which will bring up on the computer here, called HTML2Design by Div Riots. And effectively what it's doing is it's allowing you to import websites into Figma designs, okay? And the idea, again, behind this is the ability to go ahead and write code and import it into Figma. There was another one that was created, I think it was actually created first, called Story to Design. Same people, by Div Riots, and they apparently have an entire website for this. So this is the important thing about this piece here. You can even see the what's going on in the image here. Effectively, what's happening is that all of your stories are being translated into Figma components that could then be used into Figma. Okay? There it is. Right? Super cool. Okay? This kind of thing is exactly the workflow that I think of when I think of a source of truth. Okay? Because you're going to have coded components from your design system in code. I can't stress this enough. It's all in code. Of course, you'll have Storybook for it because everybody does, right? That's the one place we usually put these things. But then you can use this plugin, this ecosystem, to export your stories as components into Figma. And then your designers can use those components in their designs as opposed to something else, right? Like trying to recreate the thing that's in code by looking at it. Or again, you know, the opposite direction of saying, okay, here's my design spec. Engineer, please code this up for me, right? And all the time we see that these engineers, they don't code it properly. We see this all the time, right? And that's why it's so important to not throw it over the fence, right? What we want to do is we want to have a collaborative effort, right? Where you sit with your engineer as a designer and you work together to try to get this result out, right? This is actually something my wife's been doing because she's actually been looking into code and trying to figure out what different kinds of things that are possible in code. I mean, it's what Andy was talking about the other show as well, is that he's also diving into things that he's not necessarily familiar with and trying to also learn the language of the engineer that might be filling some of the gaps because, well, we said last week, a lot of full-stack engineers that don't know anything about design and CSS and the things that were available there. So bridging that gap is super important now, especially with all the technologies we have. But for simplicity's sake, for basic stuff, and I'm going to say a button is basic as much as we can definitely argue about a button being basic because there's lots of reasons why it's not. But you could talk about buttons, you could talk about inputs, you could talk about text, you could talk about containers, all of those very simple things that you'll see in the interface that are composed into larger things. We could see those as stories that are exported as assets into Figma, and that's the direction that I would love to see people go, as opposed to making specifications and being like, okay, engineer, it's time to build it exactly like this, right? Because if you build it exactly like this, you build it pixel perfect, then it can't respond to other device widths or user preferences or any things like that that us engineers are very familiar with. right? Trying to deliver specifications and red lines and expecting those things to be exactly as you see them in code is just a waste of time. I have to say, I really do, right? I really think that a collaborative effort of explaining what your intentions are and saying, okay, what happens if the text wraps for 2 lines? What do we do, right? Well, some people will say, oh, well, the text will never wrap 2 lines. Well, that's bullshit, right? Because if the web page is translated, then it might, right? I have a great example of gridless.design that talks about the buy now button being translated into Mongolian, ending up being 20 characters long, okay? And if you believe that your website is not going to be translated because we don't have a translation team or this is not the market or whatever, also bullshit, because people will use Google Translate on your web page so that they can actually browse it and use it and be comfortable with it, okay? So you should absolutely consider your content being translated. So it most likely will go on 2 lines. Okay, well, so what do we do about that? It doesn't look good if it's on 2 lines. Well, what do we do? Well, the next thing that you might consider is to do something like a ellipses, which is awful. Right? Because here's the other thing that I want to mention is that if the thing is on the page, you're claiming that it's important. And if it's important, then it needs to be read. If you put it on the page and then all of a sudden just make it halfway invisible on the page, that's almost the same thing as you doing like an overflow hidden on something where a user can't see it, right? That, like, why did you put it on the page if you don't want them to see it, right? So the answer, which you're going to not like, for allowing text to go on 2 lines is to allow the text to go on 2 lines, right? You should prepare for the text to go on 2 lines if you're going to have text in there at all, which you should, right? Because you want to you want to convey what this information is. Because the other option, of course, there's, oh, we'll use an icon. Well, the icons are ambiguous sometimes, and it's really hard to see sometimes, right? Right? Really hard to discern what this thing is, right? So that's what happens a lot of the times for us is we're trying to, go around in circles and figure all that stuff out. But I digress. I'm going on a tangent because I'm talking about the source of truth. I got to focus on the source of truth today, folks. So again, source of truth, I believe, should be in code. I believe, obviously, in a GitHub situation or a GitLab, any place of version control where you can see the versions of these things being put out. It doesn't mean that we can't have things that are influencing the source of truth, right? So you're going to have potentially, documents that are trying to explain what the source of truth is intended to do. Right, that's like almost like the spec-driven development that we've been kind of seeing in the AI space, right? Where we're like, okay, we're expecting it to do this, and this, right? We write out the specifications, and then we execute that source, or the AI to make the source of truth. Once we're, done with the specifications, and we could, of course, assert those specifications, and this is aligned to what we're expecting, right? My goodness, my screen's going black and white. Once we get able to do that, then that source of truth is the code, right? Now, there's absolutely an argument to be said about, well, isn't the specification the source of truth? Well, as we know, that specification can change over time, right? As we see, features that need to be added, things that need to be changed, things that we need to consider, what's the order of operations? Is the order of operations for us to update the spec, or is it update the code? Well, admittedly, in a perfect world, what we would do, and I bet you the animation's actually, here we go. In a perfect world, what we would do is we update the spec and then regenerate the new code component, and then be able to get this thing out in customers and so on and so forth, right? So there's a world where spec-driven development is actually the source of truth. I think there's a world that's possible, right? But when we're talking about, again, representations of the things that actually users are seeing, right, in the current world that we're in today, that source of truth that they're seeing is code. That's what it is, right? So the spec is a representation of what the users are seeing. Until it really truly is a ability to do a one-to-one, I don't think it'll ever really be a source of truth as much as it's informing what the source of truth should be, okay? And I think some of this problem as well is a human problem too, right? Because when we're writing the spec for something, we are absolutely going to miss things when we're talking about the specification of something, right? So there's things that you're not going to think of, right? What happens if this particular experience winds up in China, right? Are there considerations that we need to make? Are there considerations in a country that we're not thinking of that they're going to go ahead and visit our site, use our product, and be off put because of the decisions that we've made, right? How could you possibly um, account for every possible scenario, right? Because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to account for every possible scenario. We're, especially in design systems maintainers, we're trying to make the most thoughtful decisions that are going to help our entire organization, right? Because we're leaning on the product experts to put these pieces together to make the products for these users. But we have to maintain these things in the beginning, right? At the core level. This is the design system. So having a source of truth is supposed to be able to support any and all thoughtfulness and configurations, right? Anything that we can think of, it needs to consider supporting, or for a good reason not supporting, right? As a example of that, I'm not expecting to put a paragraph into a button, right? Or I'm not expecting to put a entire I'm definitely not putting a link into a button, right? That doesn't make any sense. So there's certain things that we want to hold evident to this whole ecosystem as well. So those guidelines is, on top of which, and it's a great question about that too. Is that when we're talking about the source of truth, what about the guidelines, right? What is the source of truth of the guidelines? I mean, we see this in government where they're interpreting what the guidelines are, right? How do we make it concrete, or how do we make it so it's clear, right? Now, there's one more thing that I want to bring up in the whole source of truth situation, and it has to do with education. We talk about source of truth as potentially, spec-driven documentation, or just documentation in general, where you look at the documentation and say, okay, this is what I'm supposed to be doing, and you execute, right? Well, less and less people are going toward documentation, and more people are sitting in AI experiences, right? They're going to chat with AI. They're going to have recommendations provided by AI. All that stuff is happening from an AI standpoint. So where's the source of truth there? Well, we can inform our AIs the same way that we are informing ourselves, informing Figma, with the source of truth as code, right? So this is how it's built. This is the stuff that it is, and we can have AI look at it and go, okay, this is how it's built. This is how it's supposed to be used, right? But again, when it comes to like the guidelines, right, things that are not necessarily code, how are we meant to convey that stuff in a way that, again, first was humans, now AI is going to recognize and execute on, right? We see this stuff through MCPs, right, where we have some guidelines that are hopefully written in that. But again, there's opportunities for things to be missing in there that we have to pay attention to, which trying to fill out those gaps is a hard task, right? Trying to fill out the gaps, the gaps of the intentions, the purposes, the guidelines, the rules, the compositions, right? What things are meant to go with each other. All of those particular rules, we have some, inherent feelings toward one direction or another. There's also some really good directions to take in best practices, right? With accessibility guidelines or localization, things of that nature that should be accounted for, but are hard because there's a lot of stuff out there. So ultimately what I'm trying to say, I guess, is that I do still believe that there needs to be one source of truth. You can't do a bi-directional thing. I think that's just grounds for a lot of problems, a lot of questions that are going to be raised about who's responsible for what and when and where. And ultimately, decide what your source of truth is. I think code is the best place for that because it's what the user ends up seeing. But I think there's opportunities for other sources of truth that feed into the code. It's possible. But again, if they feed into code, then the source of truth isn't code any longer, right? Then it's somewhere down the line. And you have to explain that it's somewhere else, right? Because otherwise you're going to have some assumptions about where the source of truth is. And you don't want that to happen, because then people are going to make changes and not understand why those changes aren't propagating to the places they're expecting. But that's what I wanted to talk about today. And thanks for joining me. Oh, that's right. I have an entire outro. Let me do the outro. That's our show for today. Thank you so much for watching. Before you go, help the show out by smashing that like and subscribe button to get notified the next time that we go live. And feel free to continue the conversation on the official Design Systems House Discord by visiting discord.ds.house. There it is right there on the bottom. Play nice in those comments, and I'll see you on the internet. Bye.